For the first time in art history, art is no longer theological, and I don't mean this in a Christian sense. The first art pieces we've come across were used to worship polytheistic gods and spirits. But then we reach the timeline of Christianity where art has to be transcendentalist, where even if your piece wasn't about God, it certainly was related to God. Architecture, paintings, and sculptures were all about transcendental ideas such as harmony and structured unity, ideas relating to God, and it stays this way for nearly 1,000 years, that is, until the Renaissance. We start to see the focus slightly shift from Jesus and saints and more so towards people and landscapes, although there are still plenty of paintings commissioned by the Catholic Church, and this theme of commissions would continue on for the next few hundred years, and along the way the royalty finally gets involved and, in their own way, become deified. We then shift away from deification entirely. We focus instead on landscapes, nature, and everyday people. While the subject of God is no longer there, the themes of unity and harmony are still present, themes that were originally Greek until they were used as an expression of Christianity. And then these transcendental ideas fade away entirely from the art scene. At the turn of the century, we start to see more abstract pieces that are more so symbolic and subjective rather than harmonious and objective. It's around this time period that the old regime also starts to fall apart. A century ago, the French Revolution spread ideas of liberty and socialism to the larger continent. Authority was brought into question, and there was now a palpable divide between people based on their political beliefs. God and his institutions were not only being questioned, but being replaced. Then there was World War I, and then there was World War II. People then started to question their place in the world. And it's no surprise that we get philosophical movements such as absurdism and existentialism, boldly claiming that God is not here, and if he were here, then he has surely failed to show it. The art starts to disintegrate, the mass and shape dissolves into blobs, and the things that do maintain rigidity are thrown into abstract compositions. So when you look at art history, when you look at what's been culminating towards, something like Andy Warhol seems almost inevitable. And then this is when we reach our subject of interest, pop art. Andrew Warhol Jr. was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania to immigrant parents whom were devout Catholics. His mother was incredibly encouraging of Andrew's art, especially during his episodes of sickness, and his father was a laborer who died of tuberculosis, although the family thought otherwise. Regardless, he had saved up enough money to put Andrew through a few years of college. Andrew then went on to move to the Big Apple, to cross the bridge, and become a commercial artist. It would be another 10 years before his breakthrough with the famous Campbell soup cans. It's in the 60s that the art Andy produced was deemed pop art, often featuring famous celebrities, household names, and everyday items. He would then go on to mass-produce many avant-garde pieces in a place he called The Factory, in a studio he called The Factory, where he gathered numerous misfits and artists together under his name. That is, until he was shot by one of his actors, Valerie Jean Solanas, who was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. After that, he decided to play it safe and focused more on the business aspect of art. He established a magazine called Interview, took on more commissions from wealthy people, and would sell his image to numerous brands. But some good came out of it. During this time, Andy was being taken care of by one of his employees, Jed Johnson, and their relationship blossomed during his recovery, and their relationship would last a decade. Warhol was undoubtedly fascinated with pop culture and was heavily engaged in it. He attended numerous parties and was in contact with many famous celebrities, and it was during the 70s that he would frequent the nightclub of the decade, Studio 54, and often with a man named Victor Hugo, whom Andy had taken inappropriate pictures of. While this wasn't the sole cause of their breakup, it was definitely a pivotal point. In a Christmas card, Jed explains his reasons for leaving Andy, which reads as, "Andy, I don't know what you're looking for. Sorry you didn't find it at home. I don't think, or don't want to think, you'll ever get it from your Victors and Kevins and nights at Studio 54. You did have all my love and respect. I'm sorry it went wrong. Thinking of you with sincere love, Jed." About a year later, Warhol would establish a relationship with Paramount executive John Gould. They had dated for 4 years before John distanced himself from Andy, physically and emotionally. He had moved from New York to Los Angeles and broke up with Andy. John died at the age of 33. 2 years afterwards, Warhol would die from complications after a gallbladder surgery. There are apparent themes within the life of Warhol: sickness, death, and heartbreak. Themes that we'll touch on later. It would be too much of a generalization to call Andy Warhol a pop artist, considering how diverse and varied his pieces were. But he is best known for making pop art, so that's what we'll be talking about today. So what is pop art? The name is pretty self-explanatory. It's art that's focused on pop culture, often featuring comics, ads, products, and celebrities. Its name is self-explanatory and you get everything you need from one simple glance, but despite its simplicity, it still raises a lot of questions about its own meaning. And I propose that the meaning of Warhol's paintings can be found through the transfer theory of art. The transfer theory states that the aesthetic experiences we have of an art piece is some inner state or event of the creator, simply shared via experience of the artwork to the observer. What is expressed on this kind of view is usually an emotion or feeling, but is sometimes a whole perceptual experience or entire way of seeing the world. In other words, transfer theory states that art is a way to outwardly express the artist's inner state. But then, what is this inner state? Sickness, death, and heartbreak, the apparent themes of Warhol's life, themes that become all the more relevant towards the final decade of his existence, and during this time period, this is when we get the Last Supper series. It's interesting and almost contradictory to think of Warhol as a religious person, especially considering his party lifestyle and cult character. Therefore, we naturally come to the conclusion that these paintings must have been made as some sort of joke. That is one of the common interpretations of a Warhol painting. People often claim that the paintings are satirical in nature, but others will often say that his paintings are a celebration of American culture. This seems paradoxical. How can people say that his paintings are both satire and a celebration? How can you praise the same object of your ridicule? If we are to follow the transfer theory, then in order to create artwork with such contradictory nature, Warhol must be contradictory himself. And this seems true once we realize that he was a Catholic, that at the end of the day he was religious. Now, it is not known to us just how much of a believer he was in God, but all I can say with certainty is that in the Diaries, during the last decade of his life, Andy attended church a great number of times. And so that's why I bring up God in our discussion of art history, because at the end of the day, there is something inherently transcendental and godlike about art itself. That's why it's so hard to talk about and so hard to judge. Trying to make sense of art is like trying to describe a human soul. And if you really think about it, art is the closest approximation to God that we have. What is the most powerful tool of any religion? It's art. They utilize aesthetic stories, they have beautiful sculptures and effigies, they make grand churches and grand speeches. And I'm not talking about Christianity here. Most religions utilize art. When you realize the connection between art and spirituality and connect Warhol's paintings back to his religion and tortured past, it's then that we gain an entirely new perspective on pop art. It's then that the contradictory interpretations of his paintings start to make some sense. What is God? If you peel back all the layers and look at the most fundamental aspects of God, God is prophets and institutions. God doesn't need to show himself to us because God is already here. When faith is placed somewhere, it physically manifests itself through people and buildings. One could even argue that money is religion, that these are our modern prophets and Wall Street is our church. Or a more relevant example to my younger audience would be grades. People have faith in grades. They believe that good grades equal to a good life, but at the end of the day, that's just a belief. When someone says everything is made up, it quite literally is, and yet it isn't. Ideas have profound and real impacts on the lives we lead. Art has an impact. Andrew Carnegie funded the arts and humanities in hopes that it would increase the cultural tastes of the people and encourage them to be more profitable. And look at New York now. It's one of the largest economies in the world. Tyler the Creator, Taylor Swift, Sabrina Carpenter, Harry Potter, and Naruto. They are all deified people, some of whom don't even exist, and yet they all create this huge impact on the world. And when you realize that, you sort of think, it's all one big joke, we're living in a circus. But then, why aren't you laughing? I think so many of us take pop art to be this grotesque thing and view it with this certain cynicism. We hate pop art because we think it's a reflection of our failure to advance our culture into something more profound and meaningful. We traded expensive silverware and fine china for Stanley cups and paper straws, but we're not profound or refined people. We're naturally goofy and silly and even a little stupid. The world is one big freak show, so again, why aren't you laughing? I think this is the first era of art where it's no longer purely philosophical or theological. Instead, it's just a mirror being held up against us. Some of us want to project this ideal, the buff Giga Chad or the scholarly podcaster. Some of us want to just default to our animalistic senses, the gluttonous mukbangers and horny Twitch streamers. Some of us want to regress back to the transcendental stoic and own a homestead but still have Wi-Fi. And as for the rest of us, we all just struggle with being something in between. This culture is a reflection of our contradictory nature, the want to be something more but always being something less. We are both embarrassed and relieved by our culture. We despise and love it simultaneously. I often hear some of my friends who will say, I bought a Stanley Cup, I know it's a stupid capitalist trend, but I still like it. Or they'll say, the new Nintendo games are expensive, but I'm still going to buy them anyways. I think that's the point of Andy Warhol's work, if there even is such a thing. It's not just a celebration or an insult, it's somehow both. It's a mechanism that relieves us from this stupid mess we found ourselves in and finally puts it onto paper in a way that makes sense but no sense at all. Because that's what we are, walking contradictions trying to fit into molds that now only exist in history. And that's why we're now more confused than ever. We were always confused, but now we're even more confused because the old regime is gone. There's no linear way of living life anymore. It's now your life. And so there's this wish to return to simpler times, to move to the mountains, be a stoic, and have a medieval cottage, when in reality, no era of human history has ever held humans who had it all figured out. And it would be a terrible thing to subdue the confusion, because for the first time in human history, we now have full autonomy to think about the big question of life, and that is, what is it all about? The confusion is worthwhile because the question is important, and so humans are confused, we were confused, and we will perhaps continue to be confused. And that's why the transfer theory applies here, because to create confusing art is to be confused. And I think Andy Warhol was very confused. We all are.